Hello there, this is Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller, and this is a kind of SF request show. I get sort of quite a few requests on the channel from people who want to see specific things covered. And of course, because I cover quite a number of different topics and different playlists, it does take some time for them to come around. So my apologies for everybody's waiting for things, because I will try and respond to every request if I'm excited by it. And I'm just sort of getting around to one of the two, in fact, of the science fiction ones now. So I've decided to run two different things together. At least one of them was asked for by Scott, who's been a subscriber for a while, maybe both of them. And there was a sort of request, I think, from Scott, if not Scott, somebody else, for me to talk about Gregory Benford. There's also been a request for me to talk about the difference between British and American SF, which is an interesting one. So I decided actually that there was a way of drawing those two things together. So Gregory Benford is somebody I've read a few books by, mostly quite some time ago, and I have acquired some more. And I also look at his more recent work, and I do want to catch up because I think of the American hard SF writers, he has always been, since the 70s, probably the most literary one in a traditional sense. And for me, in that sense, the most interesting. So just to talk about him, I think the first book I read by him was probably Timescape, which is the one that everybody reads. It's in Gollanc's Masterworks. It's a really good story about people in one alternate Earth trying to contact another alternate Earth to avert a catastrophe. And it's really good. And of course, Gregory Benford teaches physics, or used to teach physics at least, in university in California. So he knows what he's talking about. And also he's somebody who sort of took on the literary lessons of the American New Wave and meshed them with some of the influences coming from Britain. And that's where I'll get to talk about him in relation to the difference between British and American SF later on. So I don't have my copy of Timescape to hand, but you can get it in Gollanc's Masterworks. One of my favourites by Gregory is this collaborative novel he wrote with Gordon Eklund called If the Stars Are Gods. And it's basically a series of novellas, and the most famous one is the first one, which was published in a magazine. And in this edition it says, let's see, let's just have a look through. I think there's a kind of preamble here. Chapter 2, 2017, The Moon, is actually the original novella, which was called If the Stars Were Gods. And it's about first contact between Earth and an alien race who kind of resemble giraffes. And there's this really atmospheric scene where astronauts go to their huge cavernous spaceship, and they discover some fascinating truths about the aliens' religion. And it's a really good sort of traditional SF story, so I do like that a lot. It's well worth a read. Some I haven't read, which I acquired a while ago. These are all fair older ones, are The Stars in Shroud, Against Infinity, both of which date back to the 80s, I think, or the 70s, and a slightly more recent book by him, Matter's End. So I'm aiming to get up to date. But another one of his books that I really like, which I haven't read for years and I need to reread, is In the Ocean of Night. And the thing with Gregory, he does a lot of the sort of traditional things, and he's a bit like Arthur C. Clarke, but the writing is better. It's about alien spaceships coming out of nowhere, all the classic sort of stuff, and lots of physics. But I think the thing with this one is that he was somebody who took on the sort of new wave from both sides of the Atlantic. And in American New Wave was often about taboo breaking. So people like Philip Jose Farmer, who much of the time was a very traditional storyteller, though he did have some avant-garde ideas and did some literary experimentation, were involved. But in the UK it was a bit more literary, and it was a bit more based on modernism and modernist literary techniques. But the two things did sort of come together. And I'm going to read you a passage from In the Ocean of Night, which is right at the very end. And Brian Aldiss sort of cited this as showing how the influence of people like James Joyce had come into SF. Largely because, of course, back in the day, if you wanted to sort of say to people, well, I've read literature, you know, I've read SF, and SF is still great, the thing you do is read Ulysses, which I don't think essentially is the way to do it. I think you need to be a bit more broadly read than that to make a proper comparison. But this is a reading, and this won't make any sense to you, but it shows you the sort of tone and quality of the prose Benford was going for. And in this story, remember, there's a tripartite relationship between a man and two women, which reminds me of Triad by Jefferson Airplane, which is a song written by David Crosby of the Byrds. And and these are bands who were sort of like involved with SF in the 60s and 70s and had an SF sensibility. So I think a lot of that probably come from there, especially in California. So I'm just going to read this. Lungs panting with the effort, he pauses and looks back towards the crosshair window and sees it blowing him out, the inverse of the young lad's leaden shot, out into a billowing swack. The blade bites into a rotten seam, wood frags showering up around him, tumbling, faceted, a crash of crystal-orbiting asteroids carving the cold, muscles clenching, melting, heels biting the compacted snow, as Earth holds him in its fierce, ageless grip of which he himself is a part. He has his own gravitational field, and thoughts flick like summer lightning through the streaming wash of feelings that float through him through each moment, melting. Above was the galaxy, a swarm of white bees, each an infinite structure of its own, a spinning discus slicing space with its own definition, Nigel unable to see who threw the discus and uncaring. For there was enough here at the fragile axis of Earth, each new truth melting into the old as their fraction of the world flowed through him. He slides out of here one of these nights as continents butted against the other, and get an outfit and go for howling adventures amongst the Indians, chopping wood, trisecting Andromeda, over in the territory Oregon to Aquila, for a couple of weeks or two, all moments going, as he touched them, to smash and scatteration, and I says, all right, that suits me, and it melts. Nigel, Nicker's voice comes. Have some more coffee, the cabin steaming, melting with renewal. Of course, Nigel calls, I'll be there. Eternally it melts. Yes, he turns, and yes, it melts. And he falls through it, melting and turning. Yes, and yes, eternally it melts. So, that sort of stream of consciousness sort of thing. It's quite beautiful, but you have to understand what it means. But it's more like reading Kerouac or Joyce than it is like reading Arthur C. Clarke. And I mean, that's probably a good thing. And I would say that sometimes this doesn't always work in the work of American science fiction writers, particularly hard SF writers, but at least Gregory's tried to do that and made it more interesting, which is why I like to go back to him. So that's Gregory Benford. I would make a comparison, and I think I've mentioned this before, between Gregory Benford and Bob Shaw. Of course, was from Ireland and wrote a number of very successful, very, very good English science fiction novels. I was to say British science fiction novels. I say English because of the tone, and I think it's the tone of the prose that makes a difference between America and Britain, with what are the differences between British and American SF. And I see this as where the influences come from initially. Shaw, of course, was good at science. So there's lots of science in his books, but he was never dull, but he was also a very good prose stylist. And I think really, if you look at British genre SF, the two sort of names loom really large. And obviously we had the original writers before the term science fiction was coined in 1926. People like Wells and Stapleton, who worked outside that. And we didn't really have a genre magazine tradition in the UK in the same way for SF. But if you look at Arthur C. Clarke at one end and John Wyndham at the other, Clarke, of course, is a quite flat, clunky prose, very interested in actual science. There was a sort of whiff of mysticism in there because Clarke was influenced by Stapleton, loved Stapleton. But at the same time, this wasn't really literary writing. It was visionary writing, but not literary writing. At the other end of the scale came John Wyndham. Now, John Wyndham, of course, wrote a lot of SF in the 30s and 40s. A lot of that time, he imitated American models, and his work wasn't that dissimilar from Clarke's, though I think it was of better quality. And then, of course, around about the end of the 40s, he was sort of fed up with doing that, and he decided to apply, the sort of English short story writing approach and go for a more sort of English style and things, which is more like Wells, and probably more like the other writers around at the time. And of course, this made him a massive success. What it showed is that if you wanted to be a successful science fiction writer in Britain, it was best not to imitate the Americans. And of course, there's lots of great American SF in the 50s of the satirical vein. It was much better than the American SF of the 40s, with a few exceptions. And Wyndham really, by adopting an English sort of tone of voice and phraseology and sort of the milieu we could all understand, even in things like Chrysalids, which is set in the future in Newfoundland, you had a much more literary sensibility and a smoothness of tone, and a Britishness, which can only be summed up in the fact that Britain is a small European island, and America, of course, is a more recently settled, huge, subcontinent. So that's where I think the difference comes in, and that's where the literature sort of parts. It's also the sort of the end of the empire thing and what have you. But overall, it's an issue of tone. So the kind of tone you get in Bob Shaw's books is more Wyndham-esque. There are contemporary British SF writers who've been successful for 20 years or more, going back to the 80s. You think of Stephen Baxter, SM Baxter. I mean, he's obviously massively influenced by Arthur C. Clarke. I'm not that fond of his prose. Obviously, he has great ideas. Alistair Reynolds, you know, you can see a Clarke influence. You can see an Ian M. Banks influence, obviously. These are not people who are from the sort of Wyndham school. And Wyndham, of course, for all the fact that people like Aldous and Ballard might have attacked him, he's massively influential over Ballard, M. John Harrison, Christopher Priest, Keith Roberts. All of these people, you can see it. You can see it in the work of Dave Hutchinson and Adam Roberts as well. I mean, in the recent sort of series that Hutchinson and Roberts have been working on together, which is a 4-volume, a tetralogy, a disaster series, and Hutchinson wrote the first one, and Roberts wrote the second one, Shelter and Haven, and the series is called The Aftermath. And there's no sign actually of the 3rd and 4th volumes coming out, and I know they were commissioned by Solaris. Solaris went to Dave and Adam to commission them. They've come out. Where they've been represented in bookshops, they've done well, because there is a market for the classic English disaster novel. So of course none have been written for decades and decades and decades. So I've sold quite a few of them. Whether they've sold elsewhere, I somehow doubt it. And I get the feeling that Solaris are not going to commission 3 and 4, though I do hope I'm wrong on that, because they're very good and they're very witty. But they're Wyndham-esque, you know, they're very British, they're set in Britain, there's a lot about the landscape. And that's the thing, I think in Britain we have a fairly uniform landscape, whereas in America, of course, you've got a subcontinent. So the landscape is kind of less important in America. It's more the pioneer spirit and the melting pot and all the different sort of mini monocultures that there are across America. Whereas in the UK, things are a bit more sort of, how can I say, less diverse, I guess, is what I would say, but more stylized. And I think so if you compare Bob Shaw and Gregory Benford, you really see the difference in approach. So I think also, you know, a lot of commentators have basically said that British SF will tend to be more literary. I wouldn't say that's essentially true now. I think literary SF is really in trouble and has been for decades and decades. And, you know, I do quite frankly blame Ian Banks for this, and I'm going to talk about that again, because I think with this focus on far future, space opera, what have you, which obviously did very well, it's sort of like influenced a new generation to thinking that's all SF was. And quite frankly, you know, unless you're a fan of that kind of thing, that kind of limits science fiction to the cinematic and television idea of what it's supposed to be about. Well, it's not. It's supposed to be about ideas, and it can be about any number of ideas which are arguably scientifically explicable. So I think that's the real difference. I think a lot of the successful British SF writers of today are more influenced by American models than they are British ones. So the people remaining, the older writers like Christopher Priest, M. John Harrison, writers who are in their 50s, maybe early 60s now, Dave Hutchinson, Chris Beckett, Adam Roberts, you know, these people are very much more in the Wyndham-esque sort of thing. They're broader, they're more accessible to people who don't read the sort of pulp magazine genre SF. So I think it comes from that. I think that, you know, Clarke and Wyndham are the two primary influences. Clarke explains why we have the odd space opera and the odd visionary thing drawing from Stapleton, whereas we have, I think, Wyndham drew more from Wells. That's not to say that Wells can be cosmic, but he did generally keep things on Earth. So those are the two schools. Where in America, I think you're looking at more diverse sources. I mean, if you look at, say, Edgar Allan Poe, for example, who wrote all kinds of things, he was a genius. But it does come out the fact that there was a flourishing pulp magazine tradition in America. America's a much, much bigger country than Britain. It's long had a much bigger population. When you have a bigger population, you can have more niche markets covered. A book that sells 100,000 in America might sell 10,000 in the UK. So that's why we never had magazines flourishing in the same way, and why maybe some of the subgenres didn't flourish in the same way. So I think that accounts for the differences in the two. What's better? I think it comes down to the individual writer, to the individual reader. I generally personally prefer English literary SF. So that's some thoughts on that. I will be back soon. I'm going to talk about, I think in a video soon, about what's wrong with the genre at the moment. I was very tempted to try and do a video about, you know, the best SF of 2021, but I think it's been such a bad year for well-written science fiction. So I will have some comments on that to come next year. and some comments on the Hugos and fandom, and you know that the very poor state that genre fiction is in, and the way it's currently pandering to a small part of the market. Anyway, this is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now.